Good afternoon. Absolutely gorgeous, crisp fall day. It was a little bit warmer than yesterday. It's absolutely stunning out here along the trail, and we have a treat today. This is probably going to be a long video, but trust me, you're going to want to stay till the end. It's going to be very human. It's going to be meandering, but it's a delightful story. It's the story of Harry Martinson. And you have no idea what kind of treasure we're gonna go through here. Harry Martinson sounds like a Swedish American, but he lived most of his life in Sweden, and he had an extraordinarily interesting life, full of pain and tragedy and trauma, but also moments of absolute joy and creation, and he was playing with the stars, honestly. And so we'll get into his story. His story is novelistic and cinematic, and very few people know it anymore because we become too technical. We're spending our days, training ourselves to be taken over by AI or robots or whatever. And, Harry was a humanist. But he wrote one of the great science fiction poems of all time, among other things. And his own story, if more people knew it, they would be absolutely fascinated, like how he was able to achieve what he did. Very improbable, and that's what we need more of in this world, is the improbables and the I am possibles. So anyway, we're going to do things a little differently today. This is going to be long, and very few people are going to listen to it, but here we are. We're going to do a quick little poem. He was also translated by Robert Bly. He was also a Swedish poet who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 20th century. But he was very different from the other ones I read. We did Ekelöf and we did Tranströmer. But he was very different. He was a very, very different person. And some say he was the best Swedish poet of the 20th century, although hardly anyone told him that at the end of his life. He ended up committing suicide in a hospital in the 70s, just a few years after he won the Nobel Prize. But anyway, he wrote this poem. This was translated by Robert Bly. Creation Night. We met on the stone bridge. The birds stood watch for us. The river, gleaming like an eel, wound toward the sea. We twisted together in order to create God. There was a rustling in the grain, and a wave shot out of the rye. I'm not going to make any comment on that. With a title like Creation Night, it says a lot, but if you follow the imagery, it can lead you in different directions, and I'm just going to let it stand for whatever you think it does. And we're going to talk a little bit about who Harry Martinson was, because I bet nobody knows his story, and it's absolutely riveting. So he was born in 1904. Oh, that's kind of funny. One of my favorite relatives, my great aunt, she was born in 1905. So now I think about her when I think of his dates. So he was born in a small town in southeastern Sweden, in the Blekinge county, län. And his parents owned a little shop in town. And then, 1910, his father dies. He's, of course, 6 years old. His father dies of tuberculosis. And he was one of the younger children. They had 6 children. So his mother was left alone to tend to a store that was kind of not doing well. And then she had 6 kids. And then She was pregnant with another kid, um, not her dead husband's kid, some other guy's kid, and she decides that she wants out of this life and she wants to start a new life in America. In 1911, she makes her way to Portland, Oregon. She had some contacts there, and she left her 6 kids behind to become orphans. She waited to leave Sweden until her last kid was born. She ended up in Göteborg, where she left that child, gave that child up, and then she got on a ship and eventually made it to Portland, Oregon, where she started her new life. And she kept a little bit of contact with her kids, but like little Harry at 6 years old was shuttled between like different farms, different foster homes in rural Sweden. He never had a formal education. I think he attended some school, like probably like primary school level. And then he is entirely self-taught. He, of course, never graduated from high school, never attended high school. He became a vagabond, and then he figured he could see the world and learn something. And he was actually picked up for vagrancy in a couple different Swedish towns. He just kind of wandered around in his late teens and early 20s, and then he figured out if he went to a port city, he could get on a ship, he could do some work, and he could see the world. And I think he ended up in places, I think he made it as far as Cape Town on a ship. I think he made it to America once, like East Coast, and I think he tried to contact his mother, but that's how the story goes, and she didn't respond. She had established a new life in Portland, Oregon, town I know very well from my many years living in Seattle. I had a lot of friends down there. I had other reasons to go to Oregon, of course, the wine country. I had some random friends who had moved there, and I got to know the city well enough. Usually when I went down there, I stayed with friends in different parts of the city, and I was there during a time when it was kind of at its apex. It was a gorgeous town back then in the I'm thinking of it around like 2003 to 2008. It's mainly when I spent a lot of time down there, and like the Pearl District was being built up. All kinds of people were moving there. There was a lot of great energy. It was beautiful, great restaurants, great scene. And then I haven't been there. I did an Oregon wine trip when I owned the wine shop. When I was back in Seattle, went down to Willamette Valley, went to Beaufrere and some other wineries, Alexana, and many others. And it's the last time I stayed in Portland. But anyway, Harry Martinson's mother lived in Portland, created a new life, and she actually ran a cafe in a hotel, the Multnomah Hotel. It was called, and she went by the name Betty there. I think she had different names in her life. But she had ended up there. I mean, it's not that surprising she ended up in Portland. There are a lot of Swedes who emigrated to Washington and Oregon in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. Logging industry, fishing industry, construction, all kinds of things. Some of the bridges in Portland were built by Swedes. There were Swedish churches and organizations. So she had some contacts there, and there's some speculation about what her real motivations for Portland were. And it was interesting. There's one of the largest Finnish settlements outside of like Minnesota for Finnish immigrants. It was Astoria, the coastal town, the beautiful coastal town of Astoria. There were a lot of Finnish organizations, especially working in the in fishing and of course logging, and that's an interesting town to visit. But also the site of the Goonies, if anyone remembers the '80s film. But so Harry Martinson's mother was running a cafe in a hotel in Portland. Actually, the hotel is now if anyone knows, the Embassy Suites downtown Portland. That's where her cafe was. And so yeah, she had created a new life, and eventually she must have gotten wind that her son was a famous writer back in Sweden, but she made no effort to contact him, and he had given up on ever speaking to her again. He had forgiven her, but of course that story and that tension appears in a lot of his writing. He also wrote prose as well. Anyway, so that's a little bit about Harry, completely self-taught, orphan. He spent several years, as I said, just wandering around on land and then by sea. And then an interesting side note, and actually I ran into somebody here in southern Sweden when I was up in the town Karlskoga, chatting with a guy. Karlskoga is the center of the weapons industry in Sweden. BAE Systems, Saab. This was Alfred Nobel's hometown, the dynamite guy. So they supply weapons all over the world, and you can hear the testing in the distance. I've mentioned that in other videos, but I'll mention it again. So I was chatting with this guy for a long time at this cafe, and he works in cybersecurity for one of these firms, and he gave me a lot of insight into the industry. But also, we were talking about Finland, of course, because of my background, and he mentioned that his grandfather was a volunteer during the Finnish Winter War. There were, I think, close to 10,000 Swedes who volunteered when the Soviet Union invaded Karelia, which is, of course, where my grandmother and grandfather were from. And they were both involved, them and all of their siblings were involved. A few of them were wounded. Some of my earliest stories were my grandmother telling me all about that time period and her role in the war, and her sisters and her husband and his family. And so Harry Martinson, the poet, we're going off in all kinds of directions here, but he became a volunteer. He was a pacifist, he was a humanist, but he saw the need, and he knew other Swedes who were going over to Finland in this war effort during the Winter War. And he became a courier, carrying messages to the front lines, I guess, as you might say in the simplest terms. And he carried no weapons. He wasn't trained at all in that way. He had no interest in that, but he wanted to be part of that. And a lot of people were inspired all over the world by Finland against insurmountable odds in that conflict at that time. But we can't go into all the details and all the complexities of that time. But it touched Harry Martinson, and then I'm talking to a guy in a cafe in Karlskoga, and his grandfather was one of those 8,000 or 9,000 Swedish volunteers, and so that was quite interesting. But anyway, so Harry Martinson wrote a lot of fantastic poems, and he wrote one longer piece that I'd like to do. It's called The Inner Light, and part of it, what's kind of fun about it is that some of it is scientific. At certain points, you're thinking about, he's talking about the theories of light, and then I have the sun in the background. It's kind of nice how it's shining between the trees there. But he was concerned with the really big questions in philosophy, origin, Man's Folly was one of his themes. He has a very, very long poem about space travel. It's really, really fascinating. We don't have time to read it now, but you might want to look that one up. It's the one that comes up most often when if you type him in the Googler. But we'll just do a little bit of The Inner Light. I love this poem because it builds and it builds and it builds, and a much lesser poet, one that had a formal education, would probably have made it a much shorter, more incisive poem, and they would have gotten to the conclusion faster. But I love how he has this precise and sometimes scientific language, but he's not talking about visible light. He's not talking about your daily vision. He's talking about your inner light. And I didn't get that the first time I read this poem, but then now it's really, really it's really apparent, and there's so much genius in here. I'm just going to read it, and I hope that you'll find the time to look it up in a book or online. But here it is, Harry Martinson, The Inner Light. In the inmost of the smallest of all spaces runs a mute and constant play of color, inaccessible to the eyes. It is the light shut in that once in the moment of creation was born inward and abode there, going on. Once it had broken up into the smallest of spectra, in keeping with prismatic law, at frequencies that by the sighted would be called colors, if they encountered eyes able to see. It moved in periods, unimaginably small for time and space, but still with time and space enough for the least of the small. In fact, it found it had ample room and time. It moved in cycles of nanoseconds and microspaces, from white light and the colors of the spectrum and back to white light. A kind of breathing for light. The protons breathed and pulsated with one another, alternating signs and levels, so the light kept going in spectral balance, from dense light to split, and back to dense light and split, in spectral cycles, infinitely repeated. It was like a play of fans, in keeping with the same law that holds for rainbows, but with spread and folded fans alternating with one another. In keeping with the law of light inscribed in them, it was the light when it dances enclosed, when it is not traveling abroad and seen. It belongs to the nature of light. That it can be shut in and still not die out in its movement. That it preserves itself, thus in darkness, as thought, intent, and aptitude. That it remembers its changes and performs its dance, its interplay with this art the light keeps together, the innumerable swarms of matter, and sings with light's spectral wings the endless song in honor of the fullness of the world. And with that, I'm just going to leave it there. Harry Martinson may have been the best writer of the 20th century in Sweden. Died in immense psychic pain in a hospital. He committed suicide in a very ritualistic, bizarre way. And then afterwards, he was really celebrated. I think he died in 1978, and really alert people celebrate him today. And there was a real renaissance, I think, around what would have been his 100th birthday, obviously in 2004. And he's still being written about and talked about. And it's hard to imagine that anyone could achieve what he did. That poem, like every time I see it, and when I read it out loud there, it takes my mind in new directions, and it speaks to me in very profound ways. In its quiet intelligence, and that was written by a man who was unschooled, at least in the traditional, establishment way. And I talked to a journalist who actually met him. This was a long time ago, but he said that everyone had the same feeling about him, that he was truly the most generous with his time, kind, gentle, loving, and you often find that with people who have gone through tremendous trauma in life, unimaginable circumstances, and he struggled to find the light, but boy did he ever find it. And he was able to he was able to transmit that in a very deep, profound, and graceful way. And there was a phrase that they used, which I thought was, I want to make sure I get it right, but there was a phrase they used when he won the Nobel Prize. They said that he was able to catch the dewdrops and reflect the cosmos, which is probably the best way to sum up Harry Martinson and his legacy. And if you get a chance, you should read his long poem about the spaceship that goes off track. I mean, that's basically what it's about. And he liked that theme of man's folly, but he also liked the theme of kind of like, going into the cave that you fear and finding the treasure and living in the light and being able to celebrate whatever this realm is. And he kept his feet on the ground, but obviously his mind was pulled in some pretty profound ethereal directions. And it's worth contemplating. And I'm going to end there now. I kind of figured, if I'm going this long, why should I cut it off now? I mean, why not go to a full 25 minutes? But I want to get going. I have a lot of walking to do. I am working on a few pieces that will be, on my Substack very soon. I keep talking about this, but I keep discovering new threads that I don't want to leave. And so I'm going to have to lower my standards and just get these things out there. But I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are, and we'll talk soon. Thank you. Bye.